Hi, you're listening to Kate Palmer from sparkletart.com.
And today I'm going to be showing you a technique using distress stains and cryogen white cardstock. Now, when you combine these two things with the technique that I'm going to show you, you get a beautifully bright result. So I'm going to be using wild honey, spun sugar, and fired brick. Now, for those people who haven't seen the cryogen white cardstock before, it's a lovely thick, smooth cardstock with a little bit of sparkle through it. See that gorgeous glimmery sparkle? It really helps to give you a beautiful result. So the first thing you're going to do, add a little of the wild honey to the craft sheet. Grab your cryogen white card and smush it around into the wild honey, just a little. Now you're not aiming to cover the whole thing, so don't worry if you've got white spots. Now, just so I don't waste it, I'm going to make 2 of these at the same time. Now, to keep the colours nice and clean, I'm just going to wipe off any excess before I start with the second colour. Now, the trick here is to make sure that each layer is dry before adding the next. Okay, time for the next colour, which is the fired brick. Same process, squeeze the distress ink, sort of splat it around a little, and in goes the piece of cardstock, and then lift. Now, if you don't want it quite so spotty, you can add a few more patches just by dipping pieces in. So I'm sort of patting it with my finger. But I wouldn't add too much more because you're aiming to keep this lovely and bright. So pop that one off to the side and smoosh that second piece around in here a little. Yeah, just like before. And dry it off. So that leaves the spun sugar for the final step. Now, what you'll notice is that the piece of cardstock here, where I've laid it into the colour first, is much, much brighter than this piece here, which is, I suppose you'd call it the second generation colours. That's a good thing to know. You may want a slightly paler result. What I'm doing next is applying the spun sugar directly from the bottle onto the pieces of cardstock. Now, because I've dried them, there won't be any tip contamination, so we don't have to worry about that. Be generous here. The spun sugar is quite a pale colour. Now you'll notice I'm applying it on top of some of the other colours and to any of the white spots. Now I'm going to show you a really cool thing here. Watch this. If I squeeze this and dot it at the same time onto an area with one of those other colours, it changes the colour. So you can get some really interesting patterns by doing this. Now, the reason I've dried between each is so that there's not a lot of initial colour mixing. It means you get some areas that have got really clean edges. Now, if you didn't want that, then do not dry these between each colour. Just go from one colour to the next while it's still damp, and you won't get these hard edges. You'll just get soft blends of each colour. Now I'm just going to dry these with the heat gun again, just so that some of those patterns stay. If you leave this to air dry, then you'll find that quite a few of those patterns are lost. You could easily leave your backgrounds like this. They're absolutely amazingly gorgeous. Let me get in closer. So not only do you have the beautiful colour from the distress stains, but if you look here, because of that Cryogen White cardstock, it's now sparkly. Now I get my Cryogen White from the Paper Temptress. I'll post a link to the Paper Temptress store underneath this clip and on my blog. Isn't that gorgeous? So you've got that gorgeous patterning, the lovely crisp edges because I've dried between colours, all of that amazing texture look. And then this is the second generation one. Again, it's much more pale. The colours are more fractured. And I suppose this gives a much softer looking background. But again, with that gorgeous sparkle. So, you can leave it there. I'm not going to. The final step for me on these is to stamp with some vintage photo ink. Now, I'm a bit lazy. I don't like having to wait. So it's not great for your pads, but if you drag them across the surface of the stamp, you'll find you make much better ink contact much quicker. I'm viewing all of my supplies as tools. Sometimes things you do to them may require them to be replaced. You have much more fun that way. Alright, so stamping across the surface here. Pressing down, make sure you make some really good contact all across the surface of the stamp. Now, of course, this stamp is one of Tim Holtz's stamps from the butterfly set called Papillon. So you can see here that it adds an extra layer. The text just looks really pretty against this. Now on this second generation background, you'll notice the ink is a bit more visible because the background is a little paler. Now you could use black soot for this or any of the darker distress ink pads. They would all look beautiful. Final step is to spritz with water. Now because those distress inks are water reactive, you're going to get a bit of colour bleeding and blending. And because the distress stains underneath are water reactive, they'll start doing something interesting too. So just a really light spritz across the surface of the cardstock. You don't have to spray the whole piece of cardstock if you don't want to. You could leave some of that unsprayed. And then you can either dry with a heat gun or an iron. And so there you have two interesting, gorgeous, grungy backgrounds that would be fantastic for a card or a tag or an artist trading card. You could do this on a larger scale and pop it in your art journal. So this is the second generation colours. You can see that the text is much more visible. And you've got that gorgeous sparkle. And this is the first generation background. You can see that the text is less visible, but you've still got those really interesting patterns and texture to it all. Then what I've done is, you can't see it here, but I've actually stamped this same butterfly image underneath here in black VersaFine ink, and then I've popped this one over the top. Now this one was done on the watercolour paper, which I've then just coloured in with my Albrecht Dürer watercolour pencils and a wet water brush, so that all of the colours beautifully blend. Now on the front here, I've used some of the fantastic acetate from Paper Temptress again, and I'll see if I can get in close here. So what I've done on the butterfly is I've got more than one layer. So the top layer is stamped in pink stays on, or fuchsia stays on, and I've got some little black pearls on the top here, and they're from Viva Decor, and it's just a black pearl pen. And then if I turn this on the side, the next layer down, I've got a vintage glass, again stamped with the fuchsia stays on, And then the layer underneath, I've got a layer of fantasy film on the back of the butterfly, and it gives it sort of an iridescent pearly effect. So when you view all three of those one after the other, the butterfly gets this really cool sparkly 3D kind of look to it. And when you look straight on like this, you can see the vintage glass and then a little bit of the shimmer underneath here from the fantasy film. And that's all just on the thin acetate, so not the double thick, just the thin acetate. So this is the watercolor paper from Paper Temptress, and you can see how beautifully it takes the colors. Now I've overheated my black embossing powder here a little bit, just for a grungier look. You might not want that particular look on yours, you might like it shiny and raised. If you do, don't heat it so much. And there's that beautiful effect on the butterfly. Layering the Distress ink background onto raspberry cardstock, that makes the entire thing look brighter. If I'd layered this onto brown, it actually makes them look a little bit darker. So I've just finished it off with a little Tim Holtz button that I've cut the shank off, and again, some of the beautiful ribbons from Paper Temptress. So I hope you've enjoyed watching me create this Tim product filled tag. Thanks so much for watching and have a wonderful day. Bye.